August 27th, 1967. Bangor, Wales. The Beatles are sitting cross-legged on the floor of a sparse room at a teacher training college, listening to the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi explain the principles of transcendental meditation. They've come here for a weekend retreat, seeking spiritual enlightenment, trying to find meaning beyond the fame and success that has started to feel hollow. The room is quiet, except for the Maharishi's soft, lilting voice and the occasional sound of someone shifting position on the hard floor. John is trying to concentrate on the meditation, but his mind keeps wandering. Paul looks serene, his eyes closed, but he's actually thinking about a melody that came to him earlier. George is the most engaged, having already developed a deep interest in Eastern philosophy and spirituality. Ringo is doing his best to follow along, though he's not entirely sure what transcendental meditation involves beyond sitting quietly and trying not to think. There's a knock at the door. The Maharishi pauses mid-sentence, slightly annoyed at the interruption. One of the retreat organizers enters, looking uncomfortable and pale. "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt," he says, his voice shaking slightly. "But there's an urgent telephone call for all of you." The four Beatles exchange glances. Urgent calls don't happen during meditation retreats unless something is seriously wrong. They stand, their joints stiff from sitting, and follow the organizer out of the room and down a corridor to a small office where a telephone receiver lies off the hook on a desk. Paul picks it up first. "Hello?" The voice on the other end belongs to Peter Brown, Brian Epstein's personal assistant. His voice is thick with tears, barely intelligible. "Paul, it's Brian. He's dead. They found him this morning at his house in Chapel Street. He's gone." Paul's face goes white. His hand grips the receiver so tightly his knuckles turn pale. "What? What do you mean he's dead? How?" "They think it was an overdose. Pills. They're not sure yet if it was accidental or—" Peter's voice breaks. He can't finish the sentence. Paul turns to the others, his face a mask of shock. "It's Brian! He's dead!" The words come out flat, automatic, as if saying them in a monotone might make them less real. John takes the phone from Paul's hand. "Peter, what happened?" He listens, his face showing no expression, but his hands are shaking. After a moment, he says quietly, "We'll come back to London. Right away. Yes, we'll be there as soon as we can." He hangs up without saying goodbye. The four of them stand in the small office, unable to process what they've just heard. Brian Epstein, the man who discovered them in a Liverpool basement club, who believed in them when nobody else did, who transformed them from a scrappy local band into the biggest phenomenon in music history, is dead at 32 years old. "This can't be happening," George says quietly. "We just saw him a few days ago. He was fine. He wasn't fine," John interrupts, his voice hard. "He hasn't been fine for years. We all knew that. We just didn't want to see it." Ringo sits down heavily on a chair. "What do we do now?" It's a simple question, but it encompasses everything. Not just the immediate logistics of getting back to London, but the larger question of how the Beatles continue to exist without the man who's been their anchor, their guide, their protector for the past 5 years. They decide not to tell the other retreat attendees immediately. They gather their few belongings, make excuses to the Maharishi about a family emergency, and arrange for a car to take them back to London. The drive is silent except for the sound of the engine and the occasional sob from one of them trying to hold back tears. When they arrive in London, they're met by a pack of journalists outside Paul's house on Cavendish Avenue. Cameras flash, microphones are thrust forward, questions are shouted. "How do you feel about Mr. Epstein's death?" Will the Beatles continue? "Was it suicide?" John pushes through the crowd without responding, his face set in anger. George and Ringo follow, heads down. But Paul stops. He always had the best relationship with the press, the most natural ability to engage with journalists. And even in this moment of raw grief, some instinct tells him they need to say something. "We loved Brian," Paul says, his voice catching. "He was a beautiful person. We're absolutely devastated. We can't really process this right now. He was our friend, our manager, our guide. Without Brian, there would be no Beatles. We owe him everything." A journalist shouts, "Will the band continue without him?" Paul looks lost for a moment, then says, "I don't know. I honestly don't know. Right now, we're just trying to understand that he's gone." Inside Paul's house, the four Beatles sit in his living room. Jane Asher, Paul's girlfriend, makes tea that nobody drinks. They sit in silence for a long time, each processing the loss in their own way. Finally, John speaks. "He killed himself. You know that, right? This wasn't an accident." "You don't know that," Paul says quickly. Defensively, "Peter said they weren't sure. It could have been accidental. Brian was always taking pills for his nerves, for his sleep. He could have just taken too many without realizing." "He knew," John says flatly. "Brian knew exactly how many pills he was taking. He'd been doing this for years. He knew his limits. This was deliberate." George looks up. "Why would he do that? He had everything. He was successful, wealthy. He managed the biggest band in the world." "He was also a closeted gay man in a country where being gay is illegal," John says. "He was lonely. He was depressed. He was addicted to pills and gambling. And he probably felt like he was losing control of us, like we didn't need him anymore." The last part hangs in the air, heavy with guilt, because there's truth in it. Over the past year, especially during the Sgt. Pepper sessions, the Beatles had been making more decisions independently. Brian's role had shifted from active manager to more of a figurehead. They'd started to outgrow him, and he'd felt it. "We did need him," Ringo says quietly. "We still need him. How are we supposed to do this without him?" Paul stands up, starts pacing. "We'll figure it out. We have to. Brian would want us to continue. He believed in the Beatles more than anything. We can't let his death be the end of everything he worked for." John lights a cigarette, his hand still shaking. "Paul's right, but we need to be smart about this. We can't just rush into decisions. We need to think about management, about business, about the future." Over the following days, the reality of Brian's absence begins to sink in. There's a funeral to arrange, business matters to handle, decisions to make about the band's future. And every decision is harder without Brian to guide them, to mediate disagreements, to provide direction. The funeral takes place on August 29th at the Long Lane Jewish Cemetery in Liverpool. The Beatles attend, their faces hidden behind dark glasses. Photographers line the street. John stands apart from the others, rigid and distant. Paul weeps openly. George and Ringo hold hands with their wives, trying to maintain composure. After the service, they gather at Paul's house again. This time, they are joined by various advisors, lawyers, and business associates, people who've been circling, sensing opportunity in the vacuum left by Brian's death. "We need to talk about management," says one lawyer. "You can't function without proper representation. There are contracts to negotiate, tours to plan, business decisions to make." "We don't want to rush into anything," George says. "Brian just died. Can't we have time to grieve before we start talking about replacing him?" "The music industry doesn't wait," another advisor says. "Every day without management is a day you're vulnerable to bad deals, to people taking advantage of you." John stubs out his cigarette aggressively. "Then we'll manage ourselves. We don't need someone telling us what to do. We're adults. We can make our own decisions." Paul nods enthusiastically. "John's right. We've been making creative decisions for years. How different can business decisions be? Brian taught us a lot. We can honor his memory by continuing what he started." It's a sentiment that sounds noble in the moment but will prove catastrophically naive. The Beatles have no idea how complex their business empire has become, how many contracts and obligations and financial entanglements Brian had been managing behind the scenes. They think management is about making decisions, but they don't understand the technical expertise, the legal knowledge, the business acumen required. Within weeks, cracks begin to show. The Beatles try to hold meetings to discuss business matters, but they quickly descend into arguments. Without Brian to mediate, every disagreement becomes a battle. John wants to pursue avant-garde projects with Yoko. Paul wants to focus on traditional Beatles albums and tours. George wants more creative freedom and equal representation. Ringo just wants everyone to get along. "This isn't working," George says during one particularly contentious meeting. "We're spending more time arguing about business than making music. Maybe we do need a manager." "We need Brian," John says quietly. "But since we can't have Brian, we need someone we can trust. Someone who understands the business but also understands us." The problem is that each Beatle has a different idea about who that person should be. Paul advocates for Lee Eastman, his future father-in-law, a respected entertainment lawyer. John, George, and Ringo prefer Alan Klein, a tough American businessman with a reputation for aggressive negotiation. The dispute over management becomes a proxy war for deeper tensions. Paul sees Klein as crude and untrustworthy. John sees Eastman as Paul's attempt to control the band through family connections. What might have been a simple business decision becomes intensely personal, dividing the band along lines that will never fully heal. In the months after Brian's death, the Beatles make a series of disastrous business decisions. They start Apple Corps, a multimedia corporation that's supposed to embody their ideals about art and commerce. The idea is noble, to create a company that nurtures artistic talent without the usual corporate restrictions. But without Brian's business sense, Apple quickly becomes a financial disaster. "Anyone can come to Apple with their ideas," Paul announces to the press. "We want to help artists, musicians, filmmakers. We want to change how business is done in the entertainment industry." What happens instead is chaos. The Apple offices are overrun with people pitching increasingly bizarre projects. Money hemorrhages from the company with no oversight or accountability. Employees steal from the offices. Magic. Alex Mardas, one of John's friends, convinces the Beatles to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on a recording studio that doesn't work. The company that was supposed to revolutionize the industry becomes a cautionary tale about what happens when idealism meets reality without proper management. John later reflects bitterly. "After Brian died, we collapsed. We didn't have anyone to pull us together. We started arguing about everything. The business decisions we made were terrible. We lost millions of pounds because we thought we could do it ourselves. We were musicians trying to be businessmen, and we were terrible at it." George is even more blunt. "Brian's death was the beginning of the end. We fell apart slowly at first, then faster and faster. Without him to hold us together, all our differences became impossible to reconcile. He was the glue, and when he was gone, we just disintegrated." Paul, characteristically, tries to find the positive. "Brian's death was devastating, but it also forced us to grow up. We had to learn to make our own decisions, to take responsibility for our careers. We made mistakes, sure, but we also made some of our best music after he died. Abbey Road, parts of the White Album. We were finding our way." But Ringo, perhaps most honestly, says, "We were lost without him, completely lost. Brian knew how to handle us, how to keep the peace, how to make us feel like a unit. After he died, we were just four individuals who happened to be in a band together, and eventually, even that wasn't enough to keep us together." The truth is that Brian Epstein's death in August 1967 set in motion the events that would lead to the Beatles' breakup in 1970. Without his steadying influence, The band's internal tensions, always present but manageable, became insurmountable. The business disputes over management escalated into personal attacks. The creative disagreements became power struggles. The brotherly competition became bitter rivalry. In private moments, each Beatle would admit they'd taken Brian for granted. They'd seen him as just their manager, not understanding that he was also their mediator, their protector, their buffer against the world and against each other. He'd handled the business so they could focus on music. He'd resolved conflicts before they became crises. He'd believed in them even when they didn't believe in themselves. John, in one of his more reflective moments, said, "Brian made us what we were, not just by getting us the deals and the exposure, but by making us believe we could be great. When he died, we lost that belief. We lost the person who saw us not as individual egos, but as a unit, and without that vision holding us together, we fell apart." The night of Brian's funeral, the four Beatles sat together in Paul's living room one more time. They were exhausted from grief, from the service, from trying to maintain composure in front of cameras and mourners. For a while, they just sat in silence. Finally, Paul spoke. "What would Brian want us to do?" "He'd want us to continue," George said immediately. "He'd want us to make music, to stay together, to honor what we built together." "But can we?" Ringo asked. "Can we really do this without him?" John didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window at the London street, at the normal people going about their normal lives, unaware that in this room, four young men were trying to figure out how to move forward without the person who'd made their extraordinary lives possible. "I don't know," John finally said. "But we have to try. We owe him that much." They tried. For 2.5 more years, they tried. They made the White Album, a sprawling, chaotic double album that showed both their creative brilliance and their inability to function as a cohesive unit. They made Let It Be, a documentary that was supposed to show the Beatles' creative process, but instead captured their disintegration. They made Abbey Road, a final artistic statement that proved they could still create magic together, even as they were falling apart. But ultimately, they couldn't do it. The center couldn't hold. The tensions that Brian had managed became unmanageable. The egos that Brian had balanced became unbalanceable. The love that Brian had protected became corrupted by resentment and hurt. What the Beatles said when their manager died varied in the moment. Shock, grief, disbelief. But what they would say in the years that followed was more revealing. They said they'd lost their anchor. They said they'd been set adrift. They said that Brian's death was the moment everything started to fall apart, even if it took years for the structure to fully collapse. And they said, in various ways and at various times, that they wished they'd told Brian how much he meant to them while he was still alive, that they wished they'd seen his pain, that they wished they'd been better friends to him, not just clients or employees, that they wished they'd understood what they had before it was gone. Brian Epstein died believing he was losing the Beatles, that they'd outgrown him, that his role was becoming obsolete. He died not knowing that without him, the Beatles would lose themselves, that the band he'd built would crumble without his foundation, that his death would be the beginning of the end of the greatest musical partnership of the 20th century. What the Beatles said when their manager died was simple. "We're lost." And they were right. They would remain lost, searching for direction they'd never find, until the band that Brian Epstein believed in so completely ceased to exist altogether.